Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is one of the most well-known figures in America. He is influential with people in America, and he is well known for his contributions to the civil rights movement and to America, because he helped bring lots of progress for equality with African Americans and with other people. He is well known for his nonviolent movements, and many people admired him at that time, and many people still do. And he was very famous for his speech on Washington on August 28, 1963. And he helped lead the civil rights movement through the late 1950s all the way through the 60s. And he helped bring lots of change and progress, like the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, and much more. He helped with desegregation of buses, and he helped bring lots of good change and equality for African Americans. But of course, this is the 60s, and the 60s, well, they are infamous for their violence and for the Vietnam War, as we all know. And, you know, that would also affect the civil rights movement, seeing how, even though Dr. King was using nonviolent movements, there were still people that are actually using violence against the movement and for the movement. And things were taking a turn for the worst as the 60s continued to go on. I mean, it seemed like blacks and whites were going through an all-out war with riots, lynching, bombings, and, much more worse stuff. I mean, this was a turbulent time, and not even Dr. King could stop much of the violence. I mean, he tried sometimes, and sometimes it didn't work, but he was still hopeful, and he was still a hope to the African Americans and some other people. Many people respected him as his movement continued to go on. And well, then things took a turn for the worse. 50 years ago, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, by a man, James Earl Jones. He would be later caught, but 20 years later or something like that. It was like a long time until they finally caught him. Although there are some conspiracy theories saying that he didn't do it, but for the sake of this video, I think he did it. So his Martin Luther King Jr.'s death saddened many Americans. Well, mostly the black Americans, while some racists and white supremacists rejoiced. But this death did take a turn for the worst in 1968. And 1968 was one of the most turbulent years in American history. And his death caused more violence, and lots of cities were trashed by riots. I mean, I think more than 120 American cities had riots after Martin Luther King Jr.'s death was announced. And while some cities were peaceful due to some hope, his death did cause a change for the worst. But this made me wonder, what if Martin Luther King Jr. had lived? What if he never was shot by James Earl Jones at all, and he continued to live on through the civil rights movement? Well, we'll find out. Now, before I get to what would happen had he lived or had never been shot, I'd like to point out that I'd like to give a shout out to Alternate History Hub, because I'm using some of his art styles for this video, because I really think it is useful for animation, and it's pretty good. And I'm also like to point out that he also made a video on this as well, but it's much shorter than this one. So yeah, there it goes. Go watch go to his channel and watch his video. So what would happen if Martin Luther King Jr. was never assassinated? Well, the reason he was in Memphis, Tennessee was because there was a strike. Because African Americans in Memphis, Tennessee were on strike because they weren't getting paid enough, and they were getting paid with low wages, even for working overtime and some other reasons. So they were making a strike, and this was going on for a while now. They've always been paid with low wages for a few years now during the 60s. So, yeah. So Dr. King was there to try to help achieve that goal of getting more wages, and in our timeline they actually get more wages because they were worried of a riot and violence in the city. So they did. And this timeline, I still think they would have given them more wages, and they would have given to the strike, because Martin Luther King Jr. was a big influence, and he did get his way. His movement did get his way many times, and it's seen through the 60s and 50s. So it would have most likely happened. Now, when would this end? I don't know. It could have taken a bit more longer than our timeline. It could have taken like it would probably ended through, the strike would have gotten what it wanted in late April or May. Now, I'd like to apologize for me acting a bit unprepared, and I would like to apologize for that. But yeah. So the strike would have ended around April or May, and then Martin Luther King Jr. would have had to deal with another issue, the Poor People's Campaign. Now, the Poor People's Campaign was organized by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the SCLC. Now, the Poor People's Campaign was made for people to fight against poverty, because in 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson made the War on Poverty, which was basically where they try to fight against people in poverty. But he also got caught up in, Lyndon B. Johnson got caught up in the Vietnam War, and then they focused less on the domestic policies and focused more on foreign policy. And many people felt a bit abandoned, so they joined the Poor People's Campaign so they could help raise awareness to Congress for the Poor People's Campaign. And so far, the process seemed to be going really well. There was some support by lots of organizations. There were volunteers from places like the Peace Corps, and even candidates like Robert F. Kennedy was also supporting it. But then things started taking for the worse in our timeline when, as we all know it, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and when Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated a few months later. So, yeah, the campaign took a bad turn after those events, and sadly, they didn't get what they want. And what the Poor People's Campaign wanted was the Economic Bill of Rights. And this was where they would get money to fight against poverty, and the people who were poor would get buildings. They would help get employment and some money as well, just to help them fight against poverty. And that's what they wanted in this economics bill, and more. And the Poor People's Campaign was gonna take place in Washington, where they have demonstrations to raise awareness to Congress to pass the Economic Bill of Rights. And the date was May 12th, 1968. And the reason the Poor People's Campaign failed was because the big influence wasn't there. Because Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, and no one really paid that much attention to it. But while me saying they didn't really pay attention to it may sound like no one really cared, well, what I mean is they didn't really trust it. Like they were, like, Congress was worried of the violence that would break out, mostly because this was 1968, and usually things are bad, because 1968, there was lots of violence in cities, for Vietnam, what Congress wasn't doing, and other stuff like that. But yeah, so that was going on, and there was some rejection against the Poor People's Campaign. But with Martin Luther King Jr. there, then the Poor People's Campaign would have done much better, and they would have actually passed the Economic Bill of Rights. Now, while I have no doubt that the Economic Bill of Rights would have been passed, I'm having trouble wondering when it would have come out. Would have come out like in the year 1968, or would have come out like when the 37th president was elected. Now, I think it would have came out in 1968, mostly because the big influence Martin Luther King Jr. has had. And I don't think things would have taken a turn for the worse for the Poor People's Campaign, because Martin Luther King Jr. is actually in there in this alternate timeline. So, yeah, it would be more successful, and that would be good. And I think the people in poverty would have benefited from this, and they would have done really well. And now I also would like to discuss Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s cooperation with the 37th president. Now, the 37th president, that's really tricky, because there were two candidates that could have won the presidency. Now, one is Richard Nixon, and the other is Senator Robert F. Kennedy. Now, I mentioned that Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated in 1968, and this was before the primaries, before, they were supposed to go to the Democratic Convention in Chicago. Now, this is tricky because I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s death was kind of like a domino effect, because, right after he died, a few months later, Robert F. Kennedy would be shot. But I also kind of feel like that it probably, like, the reasons for him getting shot, well, we assume he got shot, was kind of separate from it. So it would kind of differ a bit. But I really feel like had one of these two became president, I think their relationships would have been the same thing. Like Martin Luther King Jr.'s relationship with either of these two guys would have been the same. Now Richard Nixon is actually friends with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., so they both would have worked with each other on issues like civil rights and more, probably. And Robert F. Kennedy actually worked with Dr. King when he was Attorney General and when he was Senator. He advocated for civil rights and when he was a Senator and Attorney General, and also when he was running for president. And also, he was the one that also helped get Martin Luther King Jr. out of jail during the 1960 election. And Robert F. Kennedy did advocate for civil rights since his term, well, not term, but since his time as Attorney General. So both of these instances, whoever is president is up for debate. Whoever is president is up for debate, but either way, the timeline would have been the same. Now, I think Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would have continued his advocacy for the civil rights movement, and he would have continued it until he got old. When he got a lot older, and he feels like he couldn't do much anymore because he's satisfied, or he's too tired to do it anymore. So I think he would have stopped when he was around his 50s or 60s. So I think that, and I think America would be a better place now than it would be right now, because Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. would have called for more change and progress, and I think it would have made less racism in America than there is now. Now, in our timeline, although we did make lots of progress, we are still a bit, still technically stuck back where things were in the 60s. But it is a bit better now, but change and equality is still needed. But in this alternate timeline, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. has brought on more change and equality than in our timeline.